Well, good morning, and a cold morning here is in Ontario, and I'd like to wish everyone a good day, and thank you to those on the East Coast. Good afternoon there, and good morning to everybody else in the country. This is our first of ZSA In-House Presents Table Talks. It's about having a series of interesting conversations with interesting leaders from the legal profession here in Canada. My name is Ken Fredeen, and thank you for joining us today. I'm honored to have Simon Fish with me today. Simon, good morning.
Good morning, Ken. I'm delighted to join you. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for being our first guest. As I said, it's an honor to have you as our first guest. So I'm gonna kick right in here because we got a full agenda in terms of the conversation I'd love to have with you, Simon. First of all, not that you need an introduction, but I'd like to just cover off a few highlights from your career. And so I think, as people know, you recently stepped down from your role as General Counsel at BMO Financial Group. But you were General Counsel of 3 corporations, Shell Canada, and that was after stints in the UK, the Netherlands, and South Africa. And then you were General Counsel at Inco, now Vale. And from there, you went to the BMO Financial Group. You received your legal training in South Africa and the United States. And you practiced law at Deckert, LLP, which is a well-known global law firm. And you were based in London. Sort of a summary of your career experience, I looked at it and I said, from private practice to corporate, between countries, between 3 significant corporations in general counsel roles, and that's quite remarkable for somebody here. And it's a privilege. You're a leader in the legal profession. So that's just the summary of your career. But in addition to that, numerous awards for your leadership in the legal profession and for your leadership in diversity and inclusion. We well know you're a member of a number of organizations. You were also as part of that former chair of the ACC board, which is quite a recognition. And I'd like to say as well, a founding member of Legal Leaders for Diversity, which is close to my heart. In 2013, you were Canada's General Counsel of the Year. And the next year, you were named as one of Canada's most powerful or most influential lawyers and judges in Canada. And I'd just like to say that was a wonderful class, which included the then Supreme Court of Canada Justice, our present ambassador to the United Nations, Louis Savard, and also a favorite of mine, Honorable Murray Sinclair. So you're good company in 2013 or 2014 when you were named to that category. So to the present, you recently stepped out of the BMO Financial Services GC role, and you're now chair of the BMO Climate Institute. And you're responsible, and I love the description of this, responsible for advising on the development and application of the bank's sustainability strategy, approaches to client change and related financial risk, environment, and social risk management and impact measurement and reporting. That's quite a mouthful. And it was something we probably wouldn't have talked much about a few years ago. But now it's a very current, important topic for a lot of general counsel in this country. And I know we'll like to have a few more insights from you a little later on. So you served as general counsel, I counted it, Simon, 25 years. You were in roles as general counsel, 13 of those at BMO based in Toronto. And once again, you're pivoting your career, which is marvelous. And I looked at that and I have a question for you. And that is, you have a career full of transition, successful transitions, I might add. In 1 or 2 words, what would you say about yourself in terms of transitions?
Well, Ken, thanks again for having me. The old adage about it's better to be lucky than good, I think, is never more apt than it is in my own circumstances. I think it's always been my nature to say yes without thinking. And so all the opportunities that have come up all invariably arose as a result of somebody offering me something which on the face of it sounded interesting, to which I would invariably say yes, and then find myself in it a little while later thinking, my God, what have I done? Better make a success of it. So more by happenstance than astute planning.
That's interesting. And sort of different industries as well, the resource sector, but also financial services. So quite a bit different sectors that you moved across, and also the countries that you moved across as well, and also from private practice to corporate practice. Just sort of a reflection on your part around those transitions and what you learned from them.
Well, I started life, as we all do, in private practice with a firm that I had particularly wanted to join. They had a big corporate M&A practice. And in fact, my first file was we were acting for Getty Oil in the Pennzoil Texaco Getty Oil acquisition, which at the time was the biggest hostile takeover ever. And, and so having cut my teeth on that, then declared myself an M&A lawyer, mainly because I hadn't done anything else. So I started doing that, and of course, it just led on to just more general transactional work, securities work, and over time learned the trade. But I was at a firm that I absolutely loved, had no intention of leaving private practice. And out of the blue was approached by Royal Dutch Shell, and I think at the time I thought it would be good practice just to get a sense, go for an interview and get a sense of one's worth in the market, and then that led to a really interesting opportunity with Shell, which I wasn't sure about. I discussed it with the senior partner at Deckard at the time, and I asked if he wouldn't mind keeping my desk warm for a day, because I was certain I would be back. And my first day was interesting. And then I asked if he wouldn't mind keeping it open just a little longer. And I thought the first dull day that I had in-house corporate practice, I would be back in private bar. And that never happened. And from then on, it was just a series of opportunities to which I never learned to say no.
Now, you didn't start in corporate practice. I'm going to come to that in a second, but I want to talk about sort of the shaping of Simon Fish. And you were born and raised in apartheid South Africa, and I expect that had a huge influence. And part of that was the fact that you and your family, and in particular your father, were very closely connected in terms to some of the things that occurred during apartheid. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I think you're right, Ken. I grew up in apartheid South Africa. I think anyone of my generation was acutely aware of the situation in the country, and you were either on one side of the spectrum or the other. It was a very polarized environment, and there was very little room for measured debate in the middle, I think. My father was arrested when I was quite young. I still recall the police coming to our home on a Sunday afternoon to arrest him and to take him away in a little van, with a wire mesh and so on, which left a lasting impression. He was the chief executive of a industrial construction company in the country, and he had been deliberately ignoring the apartheid laws that were called job segregation rules. If you were defined as a black person, there were, you were the person with the shovel. If you were an Indian person, if you were designated as Indian, then you might be given the trial and you may oversee the black person. And if you were the white person, well, you were the foreman and you stood on your, against the wall and you watched everyone else doing the work. And he ignored all of those job reservation categories, trained people irrespective of their particular backgrounds, and appointed people to positions and seniority accordingly. Anyway, this didn't play well with the apartheid government. They decided to put an end to it, and he was arrested and charged. And at the end, on the day of the trial, the government dropped charges, not because he hadn't broken the law. He had, but because I think they were concerned about the fallout that it would have. He was a reasonably well-known and respected leader in the business sector, and I think the leadership role and the leadership he exhibited by taking on that position, they feared would start a trend, or would set an example for others to follow. So that's that was my father, and that experience alone and others with it obviously had an enormous impact and lasting impact on my own perspective.
And that probably played forward. That probably played forward into your commitment and support and huge involvement in the DEI space here in Canada, did it?
Yes, it did. And you and I talked about this a dozen years ago, when we felt that the legal profession itself was lagging, that there was much that we could do, and as General Counsel of our particular companies, we felt we were in a position and we had an obligation to do something about it. So that was the start of it, for sure.
Well, you're a huge influence in that respect, and obviously we can understand why. But you, as a student, were targeted by the security police as well, correct?
That's correct. Look, I was a business and law student, hardly the most radical of students, but I learned years later that my name was on a database, and the police were always watching, and my student house was raided. I was stopped a couple of times on the road and just searched and so on. On one occasion, I recall a police officer reading my reams of Latin notes, and I did my best to keep a straight face, as I thought he has no idea, this is Pliny or Caesar, and then of course I was these were translations that we were working through. But in any event, it was comical, but it was the state. It was the nature of the time. I certainly wasn't alone. Many students were targeted, but I certainly was.
And if we fast forward just a little bit, in fact, when you were with Shell in South Africa, you appeared before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, authored by Desmond Tutu. And I would like just to acknowledge this passing on December 26th, a great man, a great leader. And but you appeared before the commission, but more than that, you actually wrote the submission that Shell South Africa made to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Is that correct?
That's right. I mean, again, just an example of being, having an interesting opportunity presented. I was General Counsel of Shell South Africa in the mid to late 90s, and it was the period of transition. Mandela had been elected president of the country in 94, and during his first term, he introduced this notion of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which of course has been replicated several times in several countries around the world.
I'm going to get to that.
Very good. But the approach of the commission was to examine all sectors of the economy and all fabric of society in terms of the different roles that individuals had played. So the focus initially was, of course, on the policies, the apartheid policies of the various governments in the years, but it soon led to an examination of the role of the education system, the role of universities and schools and so on, the role of the police, the role of the military. And then towards the end of the commission's tenure, they focused on the role of business in the apartheid era. And in particular, they looked at many of the multinationals and large South African domestic companies to examine how they had conducted themselves during the apartheid era. All of the oil companies were, of course, invited to attend. It was a soft form of subpoena. One could refuse to respond to the subpoena, but we decided we wouldn't. We being Shell South Africa, we felt that it was right to participate in the process, and I had the task of authoring our written submission to the Commission, which examined our role going back 20 or 30 years. That was the period I think we were asked to report on, but I provided some historic context for that. And of course, there were activities that the company had undertaken, like being involved in breaking the oil embargo that existed at the time, supplying oil to Rhodesia, as it was then called, and then of course to South Africa. The company had tried hard to ensure that we weren't directly fueling the police or the military, but it would be naive to think that that didn't happen. So we had we didn't have an untarnished perspective, but we gave we wrote a fairly accurate, or as accurate a report as we could. And then the hearing took place, and Tutu and a number of other prominent members were at the panel, and I had the opportunity of presenting our case. You know, what surprised me at the time was we were the only oil company who decided to participate and present our position, and we were given some credit for that. You know, it wasn't a trial, so there were no findings of guilt or otherwise. If your individuals were granted amnesty, corporations were not recognized as individuals in that sense. But our story was just part of the overall record of South Africans and South Africa during that period. So it was an extraordinary opportunity. It was an important experience for me, and I was very pleased with hindsight to have been part of that.
You know, later I want to talk a little bit about the impact of that in terms of your own perceptions around truth and reconciliation here in Canada with Indigenous peoples. But I learned something about you I didn't know, and that is you started out your legal profession as a, I guess, at the criminal bar, and you had a case where actually you defended an individual who was subject to capital punishment, which I take would mean true capital punishment of death. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, yes. South Africa has, like the UK, a split bar, barristers and solicitors, separate practices. And I had, after graduation, I spent 2 years in the military. I was commissioned as a law officer, and spent, at least the latter part of my military service in the military law courts. And as a result, having been firmly of the mind that I would be a corporate business lawyer, suddenly fancied myself for a brief period as Rumpole, and thought that I should really was really cut out to be a trial lawyer. Right. So I elected to go to the bar and serve pupillage as opposed to the sidebar and serve my articles. And as part of, once I was called to the bar, my very first case was a capital case. It was my client was one of 3 individuals who had murdered a couple on a farm, and it was tough. I was rather hoping for at least a year of motion court or something easy to get through, but to have a real trial within the first couple of weeks. I think it said something about the system there. In any event, long story short, I had good facts, and my client was acquitted. The other, my 2 colleagues who represented the other 2, unfortunately, didn't have as good facts, and and they were both convicted and hanged. Early on in my career, it just reminded me of the weight of responsibility that I think lawyers have in becoming member of this profession.
Remarkable. I don't think there's too many criminal lawyers. I can think of Anne Fitzgerald, of course, who practiced criminal law for a while in New York City, but I wasn't aware that there were too many that actually have the same experience. So
she was a prosecutor, though. I think she was on the other side.
She was on. Is that the
more in
dark
her
side?
nature?
We'll ask her. Maybe I'll get her on one of these table talks. Now, I just want to finish off that part of it because a conversation that you and I had many years ago was really around the meeting you had with Nelson Mandela in London. And I know that had a significant impact because I think it was in the mid-1990s when that occurred on his trip to London. Tell us a little bit about that and what he said to you and what impact that had on you as a South African.
Mandela was released, you'll remember, from prison in 1990, and he was elected president in 94. So in those intervening years, those 4 intervening years, he spent his time really putting together what he called his reconstruction and development program, and a large part of that turned on support from foreign countries. And so in his first year, in fact, it was 1990, he was in the UK. I think he went, if I recall correctly, he went on to, he came to Canada. And as you know, Canada played a significant role and was a strong supporter of Mandela and the anti-apartheid movement for quite some time. In any event, for reasons that I never quite understood, I was invited to a reception at the South African ambassador's residence. There was a small group of us, and Mandela was in London, and he was meeting South Africans who were living in London. I had literally just completed my studies in the US and had arrived in London and had started at Decade. I think I was a week or two into the role. And in any event, met Mandela. He addressed the group. He explained to everyone what he was doing, a little bit about his visions and his hopes for the country. A lot of this is well documented. And when I say as a sidebar, don't forget, this is 1990. There was hardly internet. We didn't know much about the man, and if you were South African, you had only ever seen a photograph of him in his boxing shorts and as a boxer as a young man, because his images were banned. He couldn't be quoted. There was very little coverage of him during his years of incarceration. And in fact, until he was released from prison, those first couple of images, television images, most South Africans, probably most of the world, had no idea what he looked like at that time. So this was my first encounter with him up front, and he was really quite extraordinary. And after making some general remarks, he then walked around the garden where we were all standing in small groups to engage with each of us. And when he came to me, we chatted. He wanted to know who I was, what I was doing in London, and so on. And then he said, it was his hope that I would return with him to South Africa, because he said, it is individuals like you that the country needs. We need you. Please come back with me. And I have to say, there was a knot in my stomach as he spoke, which even as I recount the story, I still have, because I knew it wasn't my intention. I had consciously decided to become an M&A lawyer, qualify as, in the US, become an international lawyer in all respects. And I had just started on that path, and it was very difficult. Anyway, I think I attempted some polite response, and that was the end of that engagement. But it was a short discussion, but it was one that I remember, I remember to this day, and
Yeah.
and everything that I read about him and learned about him and heard about him years later, it would always bring me back to that moment.
Remarkable, and appearing before Desmond Tutu. What a combination! What a rich history and a hugely impactful part of who you are as a human being and as a lawyer and practicing in Canada. And I heard that in you when you spoke to the South African Chamber of Commerce, and you more or less, in a very well prepared address, lectured Canadians around their need to understand what truth and reconciliation meant in Canada. And I've never forgotten that. It was impactful on me because, as you know, that was something I did at the end of my career at Deloitte. But you had a perspective that was bred to the bone, as they say. Tell us a little bit more about your reflections on, I know we could talk all day on this, but just briefly on what does truth and reconciliation mean in Canada and why is it important?
Well, yes. A couple of years ago, I was invited to speak at a reception held by the Southern Africa Chamber of Business. And they, and it was at the time, shortly after the Canadian TRC report had been issued.
Yeah.
And Canadians were starting to read about that. And I was, of course, initially, immediately fascinated by it and read as much as I could about the Canadian experience. Of course, overlaying my own experience, my own South African experience on that. And it was in that context that I, had asked to make a few remarks. And I'm sorry it came across a little bit as lecturing. I can get like that when I have a point to make. But it was a little bit of a comparative analysis between the South African experience and what I had understood the Canadian experience to be. And then ultimately where I thought what Canadians should do with the TRC report, and in particular the 94 recommendations that had been issued by the Commission. I felt that there were a couple of things where the Canadians had felt short. In South Africa, during the period of the Commission, every day, all of the newspapers carried at great length accounts of what had been reported at the hearing the day before. There were, as you can imagine, heartbreaking stories about how how people had been treated, how their lives had been affected, how they had been incarcerated, tortured, and so on. It was quite extraordinary, but very important for the country to read this. I felt that that part was certainly missing from the Canadian experience. I felt the Canadian press just didn't give the coverage that they ought to. So those stories, because it's a storytelling exercise as much as anything. Yeah, those stories really didn't come out. And in particular, the stories around the residential schools. And so when, of course, 3 years ago, when some of the revelations around that residential schools came to light here, people expressed surprise. And I thought, well, we have no right to express surprise. These were covered several years earlier. In fact, they were covered and even prior to that, but they were certainly covered formally and in great detail by the Commission, but there just really hadn't been sufficient coverage of that. So that was one area where I felt Canada had missed the trick, had missed the boat a little bit. And I thought that our response, Canada's response to the 94 recommendations was tepid, and in particular, the 5 or 6 that related to recommendations that were directed at business. And I think I spoke at the time about what an opportunity we should see these recommendations as an opportunity for corporate Canada, and really seek to embrace them. We're moving, I think, in the right direction. Slowly, more slowly than we should, more slowly than can rightly be excused, I think. But both processes very important for the respective countries, and I think there is the record will be important in years, for many years to come. The record of both proceedings.
We'll be judged by it, won't we?
I think so.
Yeah, and so we should. Now I want to pivot. You're known as a great talent developer, and you may not acknowledge that, but I'll tell you something. There are more I think more than any other general counsel in this country. There are so many that worked under you or with you at BMO Financial Services over the 13 years you were general counsel, that I think the proof is in the pudding. You know, these are great leaders. They have their own styles. Quite often they're diverse. And so I have always put you as one of the great talent leaders in this country. Tell me, why was this important to you? And do you have a secret sauce that maybe you could share with the audience?
Well, I'm not sure I have a secret sauce. You know, why is it important? I think it's important to every manager. I think certainly when one is appointed to a position of senior leadership, the very first thing we should be focusing on is on developing talent. My own circumstances coming to the bank as an outsider, I think suggested that the bank had not given sufficient attention to developing the talent that it already had, and I think I very deliberately from the outset decided that I should put the board and the CEO in the difficult position of having 2 or 3 or 4 candidates, that internal candidates that they should look at. And if that was the right approach, then it meant I should spend every day focusing on just that. And you know, so that may have been the principal driver. It's always, you know, we in our profession, we come across so many bright, talented individuals, but if they're good people too, that just makes every day so much better. So that was always also an element of it. And as you know, my colleagues have heard me say 1,000 times, you know, unless they were smarter, better, and better looking than me, there was no reason for me to keep them around. So I can tell you that everybody that reported to me was just infinitely more talented, more capable than I ever was on my best day. And so there's an element to the strategy of just surrounding yourself with with very smart, very capable, industrious individuals who were also, you know, good people, and that helped. I mean, if there's anything that gives me a personal sense of pride when I look to see how their careers have gone, I think something like 14 or so of them are now that in the various GC roles that I've had are now GCs in their own right of public companies, and 2 went on to be CEOs elsewhere. So that you know, there is something to it. Secret sauce?
Yeah, do you have one?
No, I don't. I tried hard to find one, as my team know. For a moment, I was enamored by the book and then the film. It's gone. It was all about the Boston Red Sox and how and not the
Oakland.
Yes, the Oakland. Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
The Oakland baseball team, and how basically they managed to distill, you know, their secret sauce to on-base percentages.
Yes.
And that was the metric that would define. And I felt there had to be an on-base percentage for in-house lawyers. Why was it that some lawyers, brilliant in private practice, didn't perform as well when they came in-house, for example? What was it that made them successful? We spent a couple of years looking at this quite seriously, talking with consultants, doing our own research, looking at our own data of individuals that had progressed and those that hadn't. We weren't able to, you know, distill it down to a single financial metric, not numerical metric in that sense, but we did identify a few criteria and a few characteristics that we thought if if the individual had that, that would help.
So it's something like Moneyball then. It truly is.
Thank you. That's
BMO
exactly.
version of Moneyball.
Thank you. That's what I was. Yeah.
No, but playing into that must have been your focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I want to move on to the role of general counsel perception, but you were always a big proponent of equity in the DEI space. But in terms of your own talents, huge diversity within your group.
Yes. For me, it was blindingly obvious. Look, I had the benefit of joining an institution for whom DEI was important, had been important for a couple of decades. I take no credit for any of that, and give full credit to the leadership, nearly 30 years ago at BMO, who had decided, based on their own studies, as much as their own moral compass, if you like, that it was important to have a diverse workforce. It was particularly important to have a diverse leadership team, because they firmly believed that a diverse workforce would lead to better business performance. We serve all sectors and all parts of the social sector, shall I say, in terms of our customers, and it was obvious we felt we should look like our customers and be as representative as they were. And that was the driver. And so the bank had spent many years building its own DEI program, and it was given a particular boost when Bill Downe was appointed CEO and made that important. And for me, it just gave permission. Really, he just gave permission to do what I think many of us felt we ought to be doing. And it coincided with the work you and I had started talking about around legal leaders for diversity. And one of our undertakings, as much to each other, was to advance DEI within our own companies, starting with our own teams. And
you did.
And we did. That's right.
Very successfully. Amazing. And I suppose all of what you had done and all of who you are as a human being played into you being the general counsel you were in the DEI space. And that fit within BMO, like you say, was that's wonderful when you get a match like that to your own values and what's important to you. I want to talk about the role of general counsel, and we could spend a long time on this. You and I have spent a long time talking about the role of general counsel. Just at a very high level, what is the role of general counsel in your opinion?
We have a fascinating role in any organization, because there are multiple dimensions to it. Yes, we are for want of a better expression, although it's a bit tired, we're the trusted advisor to the management of the company. We also have this broader obligation to serve in the best interests of the company as a whole. In other words, that would include the board. It includes all of the stakeholders, and I think therein lies a particular dimension that makes it very interesting. And then, of course, we're officers of the court, and so we have rights and responsibilities that I think other senior executives at a company simply do not. It's simply as a result of the choice of our own profession. So I've always felt and continue to feel it's very important for a general counsel to have a seat at the top table, to have a very close relationship, not only with the CEO, but also with the chair of the board, and to be quite active in that relationship. I was very fortunate when I joined BMO. One of my first discussions with Bill Downe was, he made it clear. He said, "You're not my consigliere, right? You're not my personal lawyer whose job it is to make sure that I don't trip over my own shoelaces and to whisper into my ear, not at all. And I said, you're absolutely right. I'm counsel to the bank. And that includes making sure that the bank's interests are ahead of your own. So there may be times when you and I are not aligned on matters, and it's incumbent on me to tell you when they are. So it was an understanding he and I reached very early on. In fact, it was illustrated in my whole coming to the bank. You know, I might digress a little bit. My first interview was with him. He phoned me and asked me whether I'd be interested in joining and having a conversation with him. In fact, I think he said, would you like to have breakfast with me? So we did, and he indicated there was an opportunity. And then was I interested? I said, yes, of course. And then he asked me to meet the chair of the governance committee and the chair of the board. So that made it very clear that the role he was talking about was very much aligned with my own thinking about our role as general counsel. And I immediately had support from not just senior managers, and I wasn't interviewed through a normal, and I don't mean this at all in a disparaging way, but just going through a normal HR recruitment process. There was something about the role which is a little different from that, and it goes to our need for independent. You know, our need to be independent, our obligations to speak up when it's required, and take positions that would not be popular at times with perhaps the CEO, perhaps with your colleagues in the C-suite.
That's a very sophisticated approach to the role of general counsel. You don't hear of that approach being taken often. And it was acknowledged in the book that Justice Vesey wrote, Indispensable Counsel, that dotted line report to the chair of the board and your independence from management, but also being part of the management team. Great example, and a great example for Canadian general counsel in a well-respected textbook. You have a few just rapid fire questions here, and just sort of three things. You've touched on one, which is really the independence of the general counsel from management, so that, and seen by the board to be independent of management, and yet part of the management team. You navigated that extremely well. That was really, I think, about building relationships, wasn't it? And tell us a little bit more about how you were able to build those relationships necessary to be impactful as a persuasive counsel with management, and yet being seen independent from management at the board level. Was that about relationship building, and how did you go about doing that?
Relationship building is important in any organization, of course. And when I joined BMO, I spent my first couple of months meeting every senior manager, identified every manager that had a P&L account, right? Every business unit, and asked them to tell me about their business. And we all like to be asked to tell you, give a view. And I think they found it a little novel that the lawyer was sitting down asking them, how do they make money? Which was really the question that I put to them.
Yeah.
But that's where the relationship started. So very soon, shortly, within a number of months of my having joined a very big organization, I knew who was ultimately accountable for the revenue side of our business. And of course, during that process, I had the opportunity to start to talk about my own approach, my own thoughts. I asked lots of questions, asked them what around their expectations. And that in turn was enormously helpful when it came to building a legal and compliance group of the type that I had in mind, because it was clear, the North Star was the business needs, but it was always important that we maintained our independence from it. And I would often say, from time to time, we have to provide unwelcome advice, but when we do so, we should immediately follow it up with a solution.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, Chuck, that approach might be frowned upon in some quarters. Why don't we try and address your challenge in a different way, rather than simply saying no? Yeah. I don't think that's particularly novel. I think most successful GCs would have done the same or do the same.
I think you're right. But your approach was also, don't forget the time. That was, 14 years ago, when maybe it wasn't quite as accepted, but you were a trailblazer on that front. And just quickly, you have a very strong opinion on the responsibility of general counsel for the compliance function within an organization, correct?
I do. I'm smiling because you've managed to identify all of those little bugbears of mine, and you're teasing them out. Yes, I do.
I know you will, my friend.
In short, Ken, I mean, I think this is the point you're asking. I'm a firm believer that the word compliance is the second word that follows the word legal, right? When we have a conversation about compliance, we really mean the observance of laws and regulations. And if that's right, and throughout my career, no one has ever been able to tell me that it's wrong. If that's right, then accountability for observance of laws and regulations ought to reside with the person who knows or is in a position to know most about them, the general counsel. So I've been a strong proponent that the compliance function and compliance activities should be part and parcel of the overall office of the general counsel. And it's an approach which appears to differ. You find variations of that in different sectors. The financial services sector, for example, went through a period where that was the case, and then somebody thought it was far better that there was much greater independence if compliance was not and was part of some other group. That's proven time and time again to be wrong. Just look at the financial indiscretions. I use the word kindly, indiscretions by the banking sector just in the last 10 years alone. And you see that perspective changing yet again, where I think there is this broader recognition that if you know something about the law, then you're in a better position to ensure that it's observed.
And by the way, I completely agree with you. There was a time when you and I disagreed, but I've absolutely been persuaded on that front. And that's probably another conversation to have. But in 2017, you were recognized by the Directors Roundtable as one of the distinguished general counsel. And I went to that session. It was excellent. And your speech stood out to me. And we may not have quite enough time to cover all that you said in it. And people can find it if they Google that. And it's worth reading, by the way. But what was curious to me was that you talked about a very personal matter. And that was, it was in the context of a global corporate scandal. And you referenced Shell. And just 2 months prior to you joining Shell in-house, there was a major indiscretion in that company. And in a way, you kind of inherited it. But you asked the question that Judge Sporkin asked back on the Lincoln Savings and Loan back in 1990, and that was the simple question of where were the lawyers? And that question's been asked by courts since and regulators since many times, unfortunately. But you talked about it in that speech, and I was wondering how that question that Sporkin asked back in 1990 influenced how you operated as a general counsel at BMO Financial Services.
Probably more significantly than I appreciated at the time, to be honest, Ken. The topic, I think, of that set of remarks was something about culture, ethics and culture, and
Yes.
And I think I called it the mysterious whereabouts of the lawyers. Shortly after I joined Shell, there appeared an article in the London Times, the headline of which was "Where were the lawyers?" And of course, having just recently joined Shell's department, I read it with interest. The article was about an investigation into Shell's joint venture in Japan, where our trading unit there had entered into some foreign exchange derivatives transactions that weren't the brightest moment in Shell's history, and we clearly were found guilty of a number of indiscretions. But there were others like that at the two. There were all of these trading, Metalga Shelfscuffed, I think at the time, Sumitomo. There were a number of trading houses that had entered into some dubious transactions, shall we say. That was interesting. But what caught my eye in this article, and there really wasn't much reference to it other than the headline-catching headline about where were the lawyers. It certainly played on my mind, and I thought, well, where were they? Where were my colleagues when this happened? And and over the course of the last decade or two, whenever I read of a corporate scandal of some sort, my mind immediately goes to who's the general counsel of their company.
So true.
And how could it have happened on his or her watch? And that's always been my interest. I've been surprised, with the rare exception around options backdating, if you go back a little while,
yes,
where the SEC deliberately targeted a number of GCs for what they knew, or most interestingly, for what they didn't know, but the SEC felt because of their professional obligations ought to have known. And so they went after the GCs in that circumstance. That aside, there have been very few GCs that have been prosecuted or found wanting when any of these incidents have occurred. And I find that a little incredulous. And so I think that was the thrust of my speech, was simply to say, we as members of the profession, both in the private bar and the in-house bar, have an activist duty, I think, to be involved in the maintenance of the ethics and the integrity of the organization.
You and I would completely agree with Ben Heinemann. That's what he would say. I mean, you're absolutely right. Mm-hmm. And we can't have these roles, these senior roles, if we don't take on that responsibility. But I expect that question of where were the lawyers is something for good general counsel. Doesn't keep them awake at night, but is constantly on their mind. And that's why I keyed in on that speech of yours, because it really was something that all of us should think about as general counsel globally. Anyway, that speech can be found and it'll be up on our website as well. So then we're pushing to the end. And there were some things, given that there are some junior in-house lawyers and maybe some lawyers thinking about moving in-house. Are there one or two mistakes, which you're prepared to admit to, Simon?
Look, I admit nothing. I remember that from my.
I won't remind you of them.
And I put you to the proof thereof. I've of course, my whole career is littered with mistakes, and I hope that I've learned from all of them. Are there any? I don't know that there are any particular mistakes in terms of matters or incidents that are hugely illuminating. I think if I were to do things over a bit, though, I might be it might just go more to my, to leadership and my approach, as opposed to a particular incident that I would like to have, redone. I think I would try to be a more empathetic leader. I mean, I know we talk about that a lot. I think I would rightly be criticized of being a bit tone deaf at time. I know from one of my earliest 360s, given to me by a very junior and in fact the first Black lawyer I hired in South Africa, who felt that I was, in his candid assessment, I was too results driven. And I thought, well, he's absolutely right, but why is that a criticism? I was, hence my I should have recognized it immediately as such. And so if I was to do things again I would look to be a little more empathetic, perhaps a little more kind-hearted. I think my tendency was always to put the business first, subject to all of the things we've been talking about, provided that it met all of those important requirements around integrity and so on. I think I might have done better in lending an ear to the comments of my colleagues and members of the team.
Well, I hope you're not too hard on yourself, but I'll say this, Simon, as an inclusive leader, no doubt you heard more from your team around things that they thought should be different than other leaders would hear, simply because you had an inclusive team and an inclusive environment in which they operated.
Well, I tried to, but they also knew that it didn't take much for me to be inclusive. They just simply had to turn up at my door with a cup of coffee and a sticky bun, and I would give them all the time in the world. So
if they'd asked me for advice, I could have helped them earlier on with you. Simon, are there 2 or 3 things you look back on? We've talked about so much. Are there 2 or 3 things that you look back on your career as General Counsel and in any of the 3 roles and said, they stand out for you?
Yeah, I've been so fortunate, I think, through the course of my career. I think I started off with a general idea of the direction in which I wanted to go and an approach, but I pivoted. Gosh, I'll try not to use that word. I changed direction several times. I started in private practice, and I thought it was everything that I wanted. I had no idea I would be so interested in corporate practice. And then these opportunities to travel, change countries, take on different roles, change different sectors. I thought I was a oil and gas and mining guy through and through, when the opportunity to join BMO arose. That was 2008, before the financial crisis, of course. And I thought, how hard could that be? I thought it was and it's proven to be a fascinating part of my career. I'm not sure that, though, Ken, I could easily point to a particular incident or time that was more interesting than the others. The role itself has always been fascinating. What I think, and over time, I'm sure my recollection of one deal or another, which I loved, will fade. But what won't fade will be my recollection and my thoughts around the individuals with whom I worked. I mean, I've been very fortunate to have met so many fascinating individuals, work with them, who from whom I've learned so much that's probably going to be my lasting memory of my career. But there are a few things still to do, so I don't want to sound too much like an old bloke that I am. I'm fighting it as hard as I can.
Well, I'll say this, Simon, one of my reflections on you as a general counsel, a very significant and a large role, and maybe others would say this as well, but certainly my observation on you is that you always had time. And I think maybe why the people you work with are so important to you is that you always had time for them, and you always took the time to focus on them. And I really appreciate that as a leadership quality in you. So, well, that's a wonderful way to end off our conversation. There's a few little housekeeping things before the clock turns noon here in Toronto. But I first wanted to thank you so much for being my first guest on Table Talks. I hope that the people that listened in enjoyed it, learned something. I know they did. But I have great respect for all that you've done, Simon, and I want to thank you for your contributions to the General Counsel community as well. I want to thank ZSA Recruiting, Christopher Sweeney, Warren Baumgart for taking a chance on me in terms of appointing me managing partner ZSA in-house. I'm going to have some fun there. We're just getting going, and this is just start of it. Alex Sostar for doing the technical stuff. Dan Malmut, of course, who everybody knows is my partner in crime, and we're having a wonderful time. You can find a recording of this on ZSA in-house website. And I'm certainly going to listen to this again, because I'd like to write something out of this, Simon, for people to read as well. Next up in the Table Talks, we're trying to do these monthly, is Beth Wilson. Simon, I know you think a lot of Beth and what she's accomplished. What I'm fascinated about Beth, for many reasons, she's a wonderful person, but also coming from as a partner, senior partner at KPMG, taking on the role as managing partner for Denton's, a wonderful firm here in Canada and globally, and lots of insights in terms of what she thinks of both professions and her leadership role in the legal profession. And that'll be on February 15th. So I hope everybody can join us as well. So with that, Simon, I think it's a wrap. Sorry, I will get those sticky buns to you. Stay tuned. I'll give you a heads up before they're delivered.
Thank you, Ken.
Take care. Have a wonderful day.